This is Origin Stories, a broadcast by Shetland Amenity Trust for Shetland Wool Week. I'm Carol Christiansen, Curator at Shetland Museum and Archives. Origin Stories will investigate the earliest evidence for textile-related themes in Shetland's history and prehistory. Along the way, we'll tease out, if you'll pardon the pun, some of the more important points of Shetland's textile story, discussing why things happened and perhaps do a bit of myth-busting along the way. Today we'll take a look at Shetland wool from as far back as possible. We'll investigate the earliest evidence for sheep and textile making in Shetland, and we'll see how things changed over time. But first we need to put the Shetland sheep breed into perspective. This helps to explain why their fleece is the way it is. Shetland sheep are part of the Northern European short-tailed group of landrace breeds stretching from Russia in the east to Greenland in the west. The Northern European short-tailed group is called that because they have fewer vertebrae in their tails, usually only 12 to 14 compared to 20 to 24 for long-tailed sheep. This is very important for sheep who graze for long periods away from humans, and a short tail is found in wild sheep. If you're squeamish, you may want to turn down the sound for a minute as I explain. But to put it plainly, sheep with short tails can poo freely and cleanly by easily raising their tails. In the Northern European short-tail group, the tail is shaped like a triangle pointing downwards. Sometimes this is called a fluke tail. In longer-tailed sheep, there is the possibility that poo will not drop freely, and it will cover the anus and upper inside of the tail. Flies will lay eggs in this poo, a condition known as fly strike, and eventually the maggots will enter the animal and kill it. This is why lambs from breeds with longer tails have their tails docked or shortened soon after birth. Other characteristics of the Northern European short-tailed group are that the sheep are small, hardy, and agile. The ewes can have horns, they're good mothers, and they often give birth to twins. The sheep's legs and face are usually free of wool, and the fleece has two qualities, a coarse and long outer wool and a shorter, fine underwool. One or both wool qualities are pigmented in most of the breeds, and wool color can vary considerably in flocks, on single animals, within a single staple, or even along the length of a single fiber. Wool color can also change during the animal's first year. In addition, the fleece will molt annually when the fibers have simultaneously thinned to the point that they break free from the new season's wool. We'll look more closely at the issue of molting in a later time. Humans raising sheep in the north of Europe have allowed these heritable traits to remain for a simple, crucial reason. They help the animals survive without constant care by humans. This is important in places where it's difficult or dangerous for humans to remain outside to watch over sheep for long periods of time in a wet, cold, and windy environment. In parts of the Nordic world, the sheep are brought down from hill pastures and kept indoors over the winter. This was not a common practice in Shetland, and the native breed lives outside all year, only having contact with humans usually twice a year, once during wool removal in summer, and in the autumn when lambs and ewes are chosen for slaughter. The primary focus has always been, and still is, to make sure the animal is strong enough to survive the winter months, for ewes to give birth to healthy lambs and be able to provide them enough milk to survive. The basic physical attributes of short tail, small agile body, and two qualities of wool have not been bred out completely because they are important for living on the hill lands of Shetland. Although meat and wool have changed places over the years as the most important products from sheep, both are secondary concerns of the shepherd, weighed against the survival of the animal. Shetland has strong cultural roots in Nordic history, having undergone an extreme influx of Norwegians and other Nordic peoples in the late 8th century. But the story of sheep in Shetland is far, far older than that for its Nordic neighbors of Faroe, Iceland, and Greenland. About 15 years ago, the earliest evidence for humans on Shetland was discovered at the very southern end of Shetland. For those of you who are familiar with the islands, this important site is at Westvoe, one of the best and most beautiful beaches as you leave the airport. The site dates to about 5,700 years old, and it contained cetacean, seal, and seabird bones, shells from oysters, razor clams, cockles, and limpets, and a single cow tooth, but there was no evidence of sheep. These people arrived in boats, likely from Orkney and possibly by way of Fair Isle, lying as it does between the two island groups. On a clear day, it's possible to see Fair Isle from the northernmost island of Orkney, North Ronaldsay, and to see the southern tip of mainland Shetland, adjacent to the beach at Westvoe, from Fair Isle. About 1,500 years later, Shetlanders have settled in the west of Shetland, and for the first time we have evidence of sheep. Any of you who have visited Jamieson's woolen mill at Sanus will have passed this site near the Bridge of Walls. These early farmers did not leave traces of textile tools, so we can only assume that hides were worn and used for sleeping. The fiber on their sheep may have been more like wild sheep, mainly short hair with a short undercoat during the winter only. It isn't until the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age, about 3,500 years ago, that we find textile tools like spindle whorls and perforated stone that might be loom weights. These tools increase in number and variety throughout the Iron Age and continue after Norse settlers arrived in the 9th century. A few centuries before the Norse arrived to settle in Shetland, we have our earliest textile fragment. It consists of a few fragments of tabby-woven woolen cloth. The warp and weft yarns are both single, they're Z-spun, and they twist to the left. The fibers in the yarns are very fine. They compare favorably with fine wool fibers found in Soay sheep and the finer wools of some modern Shetland sheep. The fibers are pigmented, but not exceptionally so. Soay sheep today are either dark brown or pale fawn, with both types having a white belly, although the belly wool is extremely short and contains much coarse hair. If this Iron Age textile was made from Soay or Soay type breed, then it's closer to the lighter fawn-colored Soay fleece we see today. During the later Iron Age and Pictish periods, the 500 years before the Norse settled in Shetland in the 9th century, textile production was commonplace. Hundreds of spindle whorls and loom weights have been found, and wool was likely the main fiber of choice. The second oldest textile in Shetland is perhaps as much as 800 years newer than the previous one. Shetland Museum has recently had it radiocarbon dated. The results indicate dates from about 1080 AD, or 150 to 200 years after people from Norway began to populate Shetland. It's actually two different woven fabrics sewn together and was probably a mitten. Knitting, of course, was not known in Shetland for another 400 to 500 years, so that foot, head, and hand coverings had to be made from woven fabrics. There is no evidence that knoll binding was practiced in Shetland. One of the fabrics has been shaped into a thumb, the other is part of the lower palm. Both fabrics are twill weave, but considerably different from one another. The thumb was made from a very pale gray yarn woven in a tight tutu twill. The main part of the mitten is made of 3 different yarns, a narrow black yarn, which was probably the warp, and 2 other yarns, probably wefts, one being white or very pale gray, the other a dark brown. These 2 yarns are much thicker and nubbly. The overall effect is of a textured woolen fabric in 3 distinct natural wool colors, which contrast with the smoother, lighter thumb. The fabrics in this mitten are similar to cloth found in Iceland and Greenland in this period. Using different colored yarns in warp and weft may be seen as clever fabric design, but it could occur somewhat naturally, because by combing the fleece with varying colors in the fine and coarse wools, the wool combing process separates these 2 wool qualities, and therefore separation by color also takes place. The same effect can happen without the use of wool combs by simply pulling the longer, coarser fibers away from the shorter fibers. This often has a cleaner, more exact separation of these 2 fiber types, but it's harder on the hands and slower than using wool combs. Having sheep with 2 different fiber qualities was extremely useful. It meant that the coarse outer fibers were stronger and better suited to making a warp yarn for weaving, which had to be used under tension on the loom. The shorter, softer fibers could be used for the weft. This kind of wool growth was also good for the animal, since it let the outer hairier wool protect the underwool and the sheep itself. On another island to the west of Shetland, an excavation took place of a medieval farmstead. A number of textile fragments were found, but also fragments of wool staples. These were identified as spinner's waste, wool from a fleece that had been dropped unintentionally or discarded while teasing, combing, or carding wool. These small fragments show distinctly 2 lengths and qualities of wool: coarser, longer fibers and shorter, finer fibers. This is the first physical evidence of raw wool in Shetland, and that dates to the 12th century. And this leads us to our final piece of evidence. At another archaeological site in the south of Shetland, a pair of shears were found. These date to sometime in the Iron Age, before the Norse arrived, and of the 2 textiles previously described, the shears are closest in date to the earliest textile, the one with very fine fibers, possibly Soe type. Shears used to cut wool were very probably unnecessary in this period. In fact, Shetlanders have been removing the wool from their sheep by plucking until very modern times. Occasionally the wool is still removed in this way. This is because the wool naturally molts and begins to fall off in June. It doesn't fall off all at once, but comes away as single staples or larger pieces of fleece. And the sheep isn't left bare, because by this time there is a growth spurt in the incoming wool due to longer days and better grass, giving the sheep better nutrition. Shetlanders have recognized for a very long time the importance of letting the wool grow to its natural length before removing it. In the early 17th century, when King James VI of Scotland wanted to outlaw the practice of harvesting wool in this way, Shetlanders and Orcadians fiercely objected. They explained that by shearing the wool early, as many immigrants from mainland Scotland were doing, the wool staple was damaged and yielded less wool overall. Even today, shearing a Shetland sheep that could otherwise be plucked means that the shear should try to cut along the line where the fleece is at its thinnest. Otherwise, they risk cutting into the tips of the new incoming growth. For hand spinners, it is much preferable to have a rude fleece, since the end of the wool nearest the skin is cleanly separated, with no second cuts. So the Iron Age shears are a mystery, since they would not have been necessary to shear sheep of the Northern European short-tailed group, which includes Shetland and Soe breeds. Perhaps they were used for a different purpose, such as cutting cloth or soft leather, unless, of course, sheep from much further south that did not have the ability to shed their fleece had been brought to Shetland during the late Iron Age. But there's no evidence for this, so the shears used as scissors for other purposes is more probable. In this brief excursion through the earliest periods of Shetland's prehistory, We've seen how sheep of the Northern European short-tail group are naturally well suited to grazing on the bare Shetland hills with no real predators and without much assistance from humans. They can survive on the natural vegetation, keep warm and dry with their two qualities of wool, shed their own wool if humans don't remove it. Their tail size helps to minimize disease, and they usually give birth and nurse their young on their own. This is pastoralism at its most minimal. Sheep have been providing Shetlanders and those beyond Shetland shores with meat, wool, and hides for thousands of years. We owe them a lot of thanks. And thanks for listening. And to those of you living far from Shetland shores, I hope you are able to visit us soon, see our sheep in their natural habitat, and get your hands into some lovely Shetland wool. Thank you.